Hello, how are you? I just wanted to say thank you very much for your continued support of the Cloud Therapist channel. There's lots more content coming soon, so please stay in touch. Hello and welcome to the Cloud Therapist channel. I'm Richard Simon. This is the Cloud State of Play for August 2023. As always, I have the irreplaceable Paul Bevan with me. Paul is the research director for infrastructure at Bloor Research. So let's say hello to Paul. How are you doing?
Hi, Richard. I'm good. I hope everybody's well.
Great. Good to have you back again, Paul, for another year of punishment and ranting and whatever.
Will I still be irreplaceable in another year?
Oh,
you haven't killed me off.
Yeah, I know. That's we'll see how you do for another 12 months. Okay, so we've picked on another three very interesting topics for the month of August. The first of those is a report that Paul has picked up on called the State of DevOps. Now, I know we're kind of hanging around DevOps for quite a lot, but there is a lot happening in that, which is why we're kind of probably fascinated about that sort of space at the moment. So it's an interesting report, and Paul's picked up on some information around that report, and he'll kind of give us a little bit more detail, and we'll crunch through the information. The second topic is data sovereignty. Now, there's a lot sort of kicking around this all over the place, the kind of from both sort of the continent in Europe and kind of the US, and how we share data around the world and so on. So it's kind of interesting to really maybe pick on a few things in that space and discuss the sort of the implications and impact. Now, the third topic is the Red Hat open source strategy and what they've been doing lately. So there's probably been, you've probably heard of a few things that have kind of been announced and some headlines that have come out recently around Red Hat's open source strategy, specifically around enterprise Linux. So we'll have a look at all of those for this episode. Okay, so Paul, let's kick off with this State of DevOps report that's caught your eye.
Okay. Well, I think I've probably need to state a sort of bias in my thinking straight off, because as research director for IT infrastructure, I get far more engaged with IT operations than I do with development, and therefore I see some of the issues coming down the track for IT operations in a cloud environment, in the sort of much more complex arena that's going on. And I've been known in the past to say, the devs have had a great time with DevOps, and the ops teams are getting the raw end of the deal. And I think it's a little unfair. We'll come back to that in a minute. But this report, the report for it's Dora Google, which is sort of DevOps Research report that's been going for many years.
The Dora Google, did you say, right?
Dora Google, yeah.
Right. Okay.
Because Google have now acquired and are running the program, so it's now, people will have known it as the Puppet, state of the cloud report. It's now effectively a Google document.
Right. Okay.
But it's worth a read simply because I think their methodologies, they're very open and honest about how they go about doing it. You see exactly what they're trying to do. So it always comes across as a very thoughtful and well-researched piece. And some interesting pieces in there this year. One of the things that they've done is to consciously try and get responses from people earlier in their career. So younger people.
Right.
And there've been some interesting differences compared to previous years. And one of them is that some tech capabilities like trunk-based development and loosely coupled architecture, CI/CD, putting all those things together, driving speed through the whole development cycle, seem to be predicting burnout. And when they're looking at how what are the challenges, there seems to be a burnout, and that's been borne out by another study which I'll have to come back. I only literally caught it yesterday, so we'll just need to sort of catch up, and it's a much more HR oriented one that says quite a high percentage of tech staff are looking at leaving their organizations in the next 6 months. It was sort of 20 to 30%, which is a big high turnover. So the speed at which devs is going on, the development is going on at the moment, and the drive to more, faster, continuous delivery seems to be causing potential problems. And it was interesting, and the report says that they're going to delve further into this because it was so counterintuitive to what they've seen over every year in the past.
Right.
Was that implementation process may be notably more challenging than its oversight. So they've been talking to people who are higher up the tree in terms of management responsibility, etc. And I mean, I've seen this in my working life many, many times, is that you get this sort of senior management believes something is happening and happening well. And the further down, and even if you go into the army, the squaddy in the army thinks that the people at the top don't know what the hell's going on because the boots don't fit, the rifles are crap, excuse my French, all those sort of things. And I think there's an element of a lot of the focus of the research in previous years has been too high up the tree, and when you get them down and talk to the people who are doing developments on the ground, it's a stressful environment. It's far more complex, loosely coupled architectures, continuous integration, continuous development is really putting pressure on these teams. And this brings me to the other side of the debate. And there was an interesting piece, again, looking at SRE practices, is that there seemed to be a slight decoupling between development and SRE in terms of, performance. And that there was some negativity towards what was happening in terms of SRE. And I think that was as much, and again, they bring it out in the report, to do with the fact that SRE is quite new in many organizations. And until you get to a certain point, then actually it can cause some issues and some challenges.
Okay, but is that, just a quick one, just to kind of point on that, is that a maturity issue, or is that just kind of, it's just not been thought out very well in the enterprises?
I think it's, well, I think
or a bit of both.
The two are inextricably linked. I think it is, there have been, this pressure on, and we've talked about, the focus on operational resiliency and actually EU Act, the other DORA, the Operational Resiliency Act in Europe coming in.
Yes.
So the pressure on teams to deliver not just good code, but systems that are resilient and performant over the long term means that the real challenge, and of course SRE started in the very early phase looking at how do I understand the behavior of the code on the infrastructure that I'm going to use. Now they're getting into an area where they're having to get involved in the downstream observability of what goes on in flight. I love the wing cloud term, pre-flight for development and in flight for operations. It's and so there is a level of complexity that comes in, and I know we've seen. I talk a lot with a company called Big Panda. It's an AI ops company. And what they've seen an increase in is the number of SREs coming to them to see how they can use the correlation, the AI ops based correlation of data and enrichment of data to get a better handle coming down the track, which suggests that sort of they're under pressure. So there is a problem still between dev and ops, and I've been slightly rude in the past, and I apologize to developers out there, in the sense that it's all about devs, and the poor ops teams get the raw deal in all this. But actually, again, talking to a number of people, particularly when you start talking to developers, is that you understand that there's still quite a lot of technical operational details they need to get involved in. So as much as we like to think everything's been abstracted away and developers can just develop apps, they are getting pulled into some of the operational and technical details of the infrastructure that's going to run on it. And so there's a sort of push on to can we abstract that layer even further? I'm sure we'll come back to that further. So, but I think what we're saying here, I mean, the overarching theme of the report is that this is still developing really well, and there's still a strong correlation between high performing companies and good DevOps procedures. And so but again, you can also see the challenges in terms of just the amount of work going on, and the number of times people can deliver for digital startups and digital native companies, and those that have got large legacy environments. It's still very difficult to pull the two together. So, but I think that I've started, and I've had to eat a level of sort of apology and humble pie, in that I thought devs were getting too much of developers were getting too much of an easy run at this, but actually there is still some work to be done.
Yes.
And one of the challenges for DevOps is that they've sort of done the easy bits now. It's now getting really complex, and things are starting to slow down. But of course, everybody still thinks that we still need multiple, continuous delivery, multiple into production, multiple times a week, if not a day. And actually, it's a real pressured environment, and there's a danger that you're going to lose some of the quality that's come out unless we're careful. So, I mean, that's really where I was coming from. But I mean, overarching, it's, I've seen people say, is DevOps dead? And I think this report will show that DevOps is not dead.
Yeah, indeed. No, I do agree with that. And I think it is an interesting report. It's not too dissimilar from the digital forecast report that you and I looked at. So for our dear viewers, if you want to check that out, I think we covered that in the March edition of Class State of Play. So go back to the March edition of this year for that. That was a little bit broader, but it did include data from the DORA report, albeit it was the previous year's report. And just to distinguish things, so this particular DORA stands for DevOps Research and Assessment, not to be confused with the EU Dora, which is a Digital Operational Resilience Act, and that's a completely separate thing. They're just both
the kids' character Dora the Explorer.
Or I was just about to say that they're both nicked that from Dora the Explorer. so could they not come up with something else?
Yeah, we have to throw in a few light-hearted moments.
Yeah, well, I think I joked about it when we talked about the Dora, the EU Dora Act, which is again covered actually fortuitously in the March edition, a March episode of Class State of Play. I think we did joke about it because I did a search on Dora, and Dora the Explorer was the first thing that came up, I think, or something. So yeah, I think for me, I think the pressures that you mentioned, that there is a growing trend of cognitive overload is what I'm hearing quite a lot about. And now I think we kind of probably try to address some of this, as in the industry, try to address some of this with things like AI ops to help that kind of observability and kind of doing your observability better. But I still see a lot of confusion in this kind of DevOps angle. With some of the other things that might be kind of coming online a lot more, and organizations becoming more aware of them. So certainly SRE, I think, is one of those. How does it fit in, and things like that, and how do we do it properly, and how do we do SRE in a proper kind of approach, and have a proper approach to it, not just have an indirect sort of view of it. Platform engineering, which is another kind of aspect that's really affecting this whole sort of space. And then on the more techie side, maybe, and kind of on the tool side, GitOps, and kind of the way that sort of you should be approaching things via GitOps as well. So I think all of these things are coming in, and they're affecting this whole sort of DevOps space. And you'll probably see me kind of presenting on this, both on internal sort of conferences and external conferences as well. This whole space is kind of really being disrupted, shall we say, I think, at the moment. So that's kind of really where I see it. And maybe we'll, in kind of future episodes, we'll look at those separately. So we'll look at SRE, we'll look at GitOps, platform engineering, a little bit more separate, and kind of space them out, and can get a little bit more detail together.
I think one of the other things to bring out of this, and maybe to look forward to things we might talk about, is how can organizations effectively drive more and better automation to take away the drudgery of the, every which way I turn at the moment, you're seeing people spending far too much of their manual time doing things that could be automated. And I think, there's a real push needs to come. Probably, people higher up the business need to understand the benefits of automation, and the people lower down need to understand and be made comfortable about how automation will improve their environment, not just take their jobs away. So I think automation has a real role to play in enabling developers to go to the next level, enabling operations to handle the complexity. But I again see a marked reluctance to go down an automation route for whatever reasons, whether it's fear, money, whatever. And I think maybe that's something we need to look at more in the future.
Indeed. Okay, so let's move on to our second topic, which is around data sovereignty. So I guess I can, kind of a very general definition is that how do organizations and then, subsequently countries kind of keep their data sovereign? So in other words, kind of keep it where they want it to be and not allow external governments or agencies or anybody else, real hackers or anybody, to be able to actually access that data. So how do you physically, there's such a term for it in the digital world, how do we physically ensure that where our data is stored is where we want it to be? So if it's kind of in country or continental or whatever it is. And obviously with the advent of cloud, that's kind of blurred those sort of borders somewhat. So this kind of topic has come in a lot more of the last few years. And again, we need to kind of make a distinction between sort of consumer data, so kind of how you send messages, where you store your photos and things like that when you're using those types of smartphone applications on your phone, versus corporate data, enterprise data, and government data, and how those are basically stored. Obviously, an easy route to kind of do that is to put it in your own data center, so you can store it in your own data center. But obviously, that is not always possible, and probably not advisable, because you're not really able to take advantage of cloud platforms and cloud sort of technologies in full. So yes, it's a distinction between consumer data and sort of corporate data, and sort of the patterns that go really with that. And I think most recent sort of concerns have been around TikTok. I think that's kind of kicked off quite a lot in terms of all our where's our data being stored on the TikTok platform. Prior to that, it was the private messaging platforms, so the WhatsApps and those offered by Apple and Facebook and what have you. And since then, we've kind of had some sort of regulatory stuff come in. So we've had things like the Gaia X project, I think, on the continent. That's kind of been a lot more sort of continental Europe focus. That's kind of a data sovereignty sort of focus. We've seen the rise of some sovereign clouds. So these guarantee that your data is stored geographically where you want it to be or expect it to be. We've even, with T-Systems, we've even had, the implementation of a kind of a sovereign layer on top of a hyperscaler cloud like Google. So we have, for example, Google Sovereign Cloud, and that's an offering that T-Systems provides. Just a little plug for my paymasters. But there is also an open source version of that, and obviously other cloud providers are doing kind of similar activity. And that sort of sovereignty Gaia X sort of approach, I guess, also fits in with the DORA EU Act, which we mentioned in the previous topic as well.
It's interesting. You try to make the distinction between personal data, consumerized data, and corporate data, and I don't think that's possible to do anymore. I really don't. I mean, a couple of examples. I mean, firstly, embarrassingly, the Cumbria police in the UK sending not TikTok, you got me at it now, you're sending WhatsApp messages between them with personally identifiable information in that, and then that data getting outside the encrypted environment, being shared elsewhere. And you think, oh yeah, and that's so that's one where some consumer technology made it really easy to share data. No controls have been put in place about how you anonymize the data going across that. So there's one thing to make sure it's encrypted. There's another to make sure you're not giving people's personal information away, because it then creeps out beyond that. The second, and I think is probably slightly more, well, the other one's important, but this one shows how difficult it is to do, is in healthcare. We are all going to be having healthcare devices that pick up our information. If we want the National Health Service and any health service to be able to cope with, demographic changes and health changes and all the new things you can do in health, you're going to be collecting all that data. That's personal data, and it's, and we're going to share, details of how far we walked yesterday, and you've got the Strava cycling app, where the hell we cycled and how many hills I went up and all those sort of things. That all feeds into sort of health data. But at some point is going into corporate databases, and whether those are healthcare databases. And again, we've seen challenges there. So I think it's really difficult to separate the two. And when you come to sovereign data, I mean, clearly the hyperscalers have gone to some lengths to ensure, by setting up new zones and new regions, that you can physically separate out the data and say that this particular data only sits in that particular zone. So it's possible to do. But again, you come back to what's the responsibility of the hyperscaler and what's the responsibility of the business, and most of the responsibility for this lies with the business. AWS, Google, Microsoft Azure can all put in place regional data center capabilities and the ability to have separate and also firewall zones so that you can do that. But then it's down to individual organizations' culture and processes to make sure that works. But I do think it's incredibly difficult to separate out private, consumerized data from corporate data these days. It's getting harder and harder.
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably largely agree with that. But I think I think there's still a distinction for me, because you're like the messages on WhatsApp or something. Yes, they are encrypted and whatever, and we're not talking kind of about security necessarily, but kind of where they are stored and so on, and how they're sort of used. And even if somebody's just storing photos in a sort of a cloud platform, like the sort of the very closed sort of Apple sort of ecosystem and so on, that's kind of a lot of consumer stuff. That's never going to be necessarily processed by a corporate system of any kind, although there is a crossover, as you said, kind of, for example, in health. But again, I would have expected in most cases in that space for the outcome, the event that's being generated, or the metadata that's being generated, to be consumed or stored, processed, and generated and consumed by a corporate system, not the original data itself. But either way, it's a fine line, and it's really tough to achieve. And sure, we can kind of put in things like data sovereignty layers and the kind of the Gaia X sort of frameworks. We'll get to, I think, the EU and US data transfer sort of agreement in a minute. But but I think it's really difficult to do. And we see, companies falling foul of it. Like, Facebook is, I think, either was fined or is continuing to be fined by the EU for breach of for data breaches constantly. So lots of people are getting their wrists slapped because of, they're not complying, or they just haven't, got around to architecting it properly. The other point I wanted to make was storing is one thing, but then securing the data in flight and at rest is also part of this, or should be part of it. And obviously the processing, which is the bit I said about sort of, you grab my GPS and number of steps from my watch or my, device, and then that goes into an app. The app goes to a server, blah blah blah, and it gets stored in Beijing or something somewhere, because that's where the company is, headquartered. So there is those kind of distinctions. They're kind of storing it, securing it, and processing it is really, I think, important as well to be aware of.
Yeah, one of the big challenges, I think, is understanding where all your data is. I mean, we've ended up with sort of multi-cloud arena. We've ended up with, quite often, with the cloud happening by not by mistake, but it's happening in an ad hoc way.
So more organic.
It's still not got to the point where we're starting to talk now about how do you architect your data in the multi-cloud world, and how do you literally start finding out where it is, and how do you pull it all together, and you would talk about metadata and how we organize all that. And it is incredibly difficult, but again, maybe one of the things we ought to be looking at is the whole issue of data quality, and how do you control, and how do you get that in a state where it can be used. And the first one is, where is it? And that's part of the problem. Where is the data?
So the location of where you store it, I think, seems to be the chief concern. But like I said, I don't think they should be forgetting about how it's secured, so it's encrypted and whatever, both in flight and at rest. And also who gets the permission or the privilege to actually process it as well. Right, and that's another area. So just to touch on very briefly, there is the EU-US Data Transfers Act. So this a so-called adequacy decision that was agreed, I believe, in July, based on the data privacy framework that the EU has put together. So our understanding of that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that doesn't mean that US companies cannot have the data, but how they process it and what do they do with it and where do they share it is the aspect of it that's agreed. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there've been 2 or 3 attempts to the Patriot Act started this off many years ago, and its provisions scared the living daylights out of most organizations. And there've been various attempts, and obviously the EU's tried with a sort of various privacy shield initiatives, but they've been if you like, challenged in the courts. I mean, the Schrems a challenge in the courts for storing out the Austrian guy who's sort of challenged successfully, and the European Court of Justice has actually struck these things down. So you've got to a point now where it appears that this Privacy Shield 2.0, as they're calling it, that the EU's approved, given an adequacy test, is now happy that this is going on. So I think it's, is there still going to be concerns that a bad actor, whether that's the NSA in the States or anybody else? I mean, let's say, I don't think any of our security services are adverse to having a quick peek. That's a constant thing we need to be aware of. But I think we've got to a point now where there's probably slightly less barriers to shifting that data, particularly across the Atlantic, than there was before. I mean, France, Germany, very, very aware and annoyed, I think,
and weary. Yeah.
And of doing that. In the UK, I think we've taken a slightly different attitude towards that. Whether that's the right or wrong thing, we trust our American cousins more than the French Germans trust them to do the right thing. So difficult one. But I think what this has done is take away some of the angst and grief, and that there should be less challenges. But I agree with you about this whole issue of in-flight and at rest data needing to be secured. And again, this is another area of sort of shared responsibility, where more of the responsibility lies with businesses rather than the hyperscalers. So just be aware of that. I think that's another thing. Yes, they can protect their external boundaries, if you like. They protect the cloud, but what's in the cloud is usually down to an organization, and data resides in the cloud. And I think data, so again, just don't forget that it's your responsibility to manage the security of that data at rest or in flight.
Indeed, yeah. I think there's certain decisions that consumers, would need to make consciously and subconsciously need to make, and then there's kind of corporations, how they, enterprises, how they kind of both comply with their sort of market sector, regulations, as well as protecting their own data. And then there's ultimately governments as well, having their responsibility for really for the entire nation's data, I suppose. Kind of looking after all that.
No challenge there then.
Yeah, easy peasy. Okay, right. So we could go on talking about that, and in the report, I think I'll probably provide some information on the links on that. But it is a data sovereignty in general is an interesting topic, and will continue to be, I think, for a long time. And kind of if anything, it's kind of the data breaches that happen, and people get organizations or these vendors and consumer platforms get fined.
I think generally the world is less open these days, for various reasons, and whether it's physical trade or movement of data, all these things. I think people are going to have to look at this in far more detail, because there's too many conflicts going on out there at the moment, and too many different positions being taken for it to be a place that you can ignore. I think you can ignore.
Right. Okay, so let's move on to our third topic, which is Red Hat's open source strategy and recent decisions. Now, there was a recent announcement from Red Hat, probably a month or two ago, where they basically decided to effectively stop releasing the source code for Red Hat Enterprise Linux, or RHEL, downstream. Now, I picked up the Register headline or article on this, and let me read that to you. So I'll quote this now. It says, Red Hat strikes a crushing blow against RHEL downstreams. From now on, only CentOS streams source code is available to all. So CentOS stream being their upstream version of CentOS, which was also another crushing blow. I don't know how long ago that was now, a couple of years ago or something like that, when they decided to support or create CentOS stream versus supporting CentOS, which is a downstream project. So I won't go into the kind of details. Maybe I'll find a source for this, but effectively you have, kind of how the whole thing kind of works. You have the sort of the open source project, and then from that you can kind of take, and create your own sort of distributions or versions of the software that you want. And if you happen to be kind of doing something like Red Hat Enterprise Linux, that becomes the kind of a pivotal point, an anchor, where because it's open source, it's all based on open source projects. You're supposed to share your open source downstream. So anything below you, any projects and other distributions, in this case operating system distributions, in this case, or distros is called for short, can benefit from the work that you've done. Yeah, so if you've enhanced the project or added some extra security, whatever it is, a new features, tools, whatever it is, anybody can, because you have to reshare what you've done in the overall project, so it goes upstream, but it can also go downstream. So somebody can take the RHEL source code and say, okay, well, I'll branch it off, I'll create my own distro, I'll fork it off, and the fork in this case will be CentOS, for example, or it'll be Fedora or whatever it is. And I don't know exactly how they kind of fit in the hierarchy, but that's the essential idea. So Red Hat has kind of decided to stop the downstream offerings of its open source code for RHEL. And that's obviously put the cat among the pigeons. Now, it already did that a few years ago when it stopped supporting CentOS. So you had a bunch of different distributions cropping up, like Alma Linux and Rocky Linux and so on, appearing because CentOS was being essentially deprecated. It was no longer going to get any support and updates. And now we've got RHEL being, its source code being stopped from downstream, from being shared downstream, and only being made available. I think the announcements from Red Hat said it was only going to be made available to corporates, and the corporate agreement or license is basically just to, I think, look at the code, but they can't reuse it themselves. They can't make use of it. So that's set this, cat among the pigeons. It's bad news for kind of downstream, sort of projects. And like I said, there's a number of those, including Oracle's Unbreakable Linux. I believe that's also based on Red Hat Enterprise Linux as well. So only CentOS upstream is kind of not affected by this announcement, but this is a huge impact, I think, on kind of downstream distributions. And also, I think the overall kind of feeling is that it's not a kind of a fair approach as well. It's not kind of that sort of fair and open approach it's not in the spirit of open source. I think that's kind of both my personal opinion, but also other people have kind of expressed the same thing to me, and in the press as well, I believe. That's kind of the idea of it. So yeah, so what do you think about that?
Well, to take your last phrase there, is it in the spirit of open source? And the answer, of course, is no. Was it always going to happen? Is it always likely to happen in the future that this sort of thing will happen? I think the answer is yes. I mean, if you look at Red Hat, we won't specifically link this to the IBM acquisition, but as you get into an enterprise environment, you get pulled in two different directions. Yes, you want new developments and new features and functions, but actually most enterprises want stability. They want their systems to run, they want their systems supported, and you can look at the amount of new code that needs to be supported, the amount of new systems that are out there, and the shortage of people to manage them. And therefore, I think there's always going to be this sort of clash at some point in the maturity curve of these new development environments and these new operating environments, that says at some point the ability to keep throwing more new stuff at it, as opposed to making sure that the existing stuff runs, is going to be there. That's the sort of operational side, and the other is again a sort of financial one. I mean, it's financial drivers of enterprises and financial drivers of the big vendors are not necessarily anywhere aligned to the drivers of an open source development community, and those two will come into conflict from time to time. And again, as it gets more mature, early on in the cycle, when it looks like, hey, we can go, Red Hat, and everybody's going to jump on board, and isn't that going to be wonderful? And we're going to make lots of money from all the other things we can add on around it, because all the customers are going to go to Red Hat. to suddenly it becomes, God, I've got to support all this stuff. Enterprises want support. How do I actually control that environment? And so I think it's an unpleasant but natural development of that environment. And you probably go back to earlier iterations of Unix, you know, and when it first came along, and you know, yes, it was going to be the one that broke the dominance of the proprietary environments, but again, the challenges of, you know, making money out of that for organization, you know, for the vendors, and then being able to support their customers adequately, because there's risk if they can't support it, means that they tend to close this off. So I agree with you. It's against the spirit of open source. It probably puts a kink in that open source community for a while, but you know, one of the things we've discovered over the last 10 or 15 years is that no organization, no vendor organization can actually cope with, or you know, in terms of competitiveness, the ability of the open source arena to develop new applications and new opportunities out there. So this is a kink in the, you know, in the road. It's going to be uncomfortable for certain people caught in their own place. But if we've learned anything, is that the power of the open source community is, you know, greater probably than the power of individual vendors to do these sort of things for the long term. And what you'll get is an alternative to RHEL coming out. You know, yeah, that'll happen, an open source, and you'll go round the cycle again. It's painful. Is it sensible? You know, we can have all those debates, but that's the way, you know, businesses work.
Yeah, I think, yeah, and just a couple of points on what you said, and I do agree with, I think, with all of that. And we'll get to the something is going to happen. Something has happened. People are already reacting to it, just like I said, the previous kind of decision of, you know, of stopping support for CentOS. You had all these, you know, distros kind of appearing to take its place. One point was, for me, Red Hat's always kind of had that sort of corporate feel, corporate approach to it. So because you kind of mentioned, you know, oh yeah, now they're kind of part of IBM. They're almost really, it's almost like reverse acquisition, really. So the current CEO of IBM is an ex-Red Hatter. So you know, that's kind of definitely putting a stamp on the parent there. But they've always had this kind of corporate feel. They kind of gave me the same impression in late 90s and sort of early 2000s, when kind of Linux was kicking up a lot. And ironically, the likes of IBM, you know, got invested a great deal in Linux at the time. And there were even, I can hopefully say this without anybody telling me off, there were even internal rumors that we were going to acquire Red Hat, amongst others, in the x86 world. We were going to acquire, IBM was going to acquire Red Hat at the time. For all those who don't know, check out my LinkedIn profile. You see that I actually worked for IBM for a long time. So I speak from you know, a source of truth on that. But yeah, so there was that kind of, maybe they should have done it back then, because it would cost a hell of a lot less than, you know, than it does that it's done kind of recently. But anyway, so that sort of feel has always kind of been there. And they kind of gave me the same impression as, they kind of did the same thing on the software side as Compaq did back then on the hardware side. So they kind of legitimized, you know, and had that sort of corporate image. You know, Compaq kind of did that for x86 servers. You know, it was kind of, they were business servers. They weren't kind of this little piece of machine that, you know, machinery that you put next to your AS400 and IBM mainframes and Unix, you know, whatever mid-range that you had. Compaq sort of tried to legitimize and kind of, you know, we run business applications as well, you know, whereas obviously the Unix kind of boys at the time were saying, you know, well, that's just an x86 machine, you know, that doesn't run anything, you know, business related. So that image that Compaq had, I think Red Hat is, you know, is kind of tried to replicate, but on the software side. So again, kind of distancing themselves from, you know, other open source projects and communities. So they, for example, you know, for OpenShift, they chose a different project, you know, for that, whereas everybody else was in the Cloud Foundry camp when it came to PaaS, and PaaS was kind of the first reason why you had platforms like OpenShift sort of appear. Again, they acquired Ansible for things like configuration management, whereas everybody else is pretty much kind of using Terraform and SaltStack and and Chef and Puppet and what have you. And again, on the open source storage side of it as well, on the software-defined storage, I should say, they had Gluster, and Gluster FS was kind of their project, whereas everybody else was doing Ceph. And that's kind of the software-defined storage project that everybody else was doing. So they've always been on in a different camp and kind of not following the community. So I think that sort of corporate feel has always been there with Red Hat, and maybe actually it's why they appealed to IBM quite a lot, because they had that kind of corporate-y approach to how they did things. They didn't kind of stick with just the jeans and t-shirts and the geeky kind of approach from the open source community.
I mean, they came with a bunch of customers that IBM lusted after. I think that's probably.
I'm sure as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, a lot of it is you're gaining market share, power by buying up what is effectively a customer base.
Yeah, and then the other point was that obviously with this announcement there has been some reaction to it. Oracle and a number of other vendors have reacted by creating the Open ELA. I think it's the Open Enterprise Linux Association. So this is basically getting hold of RHEL open source and making it available somehow. I don't know under what license. I'm sure the announcements will tell us that, and I'll provide some links and details on that. But that's a reaction, almost immediate reaction by Oracle, because obviously, as we said, Oracle Unbreakable Linux is based on RHEL for its source code.
Yeah. I mean, this is just an ongoing cycle again. It'd be interesting to see what Oracle. I mean, Oracle itself is very interesting. I mean, it's got a reputation going back many years in the proprietary world that most companies wouldn't want to have, to put it mildly, in terms of the way they've sort of closed off and very aggressive licensing and all those sort of issues. And yet Oracle Cloud is probably one of the more open, non-hyperscale clouds that's out there, and they've done. And you go talk to people at Oracle who are involved in OCI and Oracle Cloud infrastructure. The Oracle Cloud at Home, some really useful things that they're doing, and very open. Yeah. But again, you can imagine some of the corporate debates that go on, between, it's an interesting cultural one, but, Oracle's got an awful lot of history and sort of to convince people that it's going to be, a good open source player. It'll be interesting to see how it plays. Yeah,
I know maybe something we can revisit to kind of just see how the story sort of progresses in the future. Okay, I think we've reached the end of another episode. Paul, thank you for all your insights as always.
Pleasure.
I think you were irreplaceable at the beginning of the episode. You're definitely extremely irreplaceable by the end of it. I really appreciate your insight.
I better start cloning myself, I think.
Well, what did I joke to you about the other day? We said we should download ourselves into an AI platform or something. I'm sure that's not too far in the distance.
Absolutely, that might make more sense.
Yeah, and then Cloud State of Play can continue without us. It'd just be two avatars talking to each other. Excellent. Okay, so all the links for all the topics that we've discussed today will be in the description of the video. All the kind of the stuff that we've talked about, we'll try and add in as much as we can. Thank you guys all for watching. Please continue your support for the channel. I really appreciate that. Bye for now.
Bye.
Thank you for watching this talk. If you enjoyed the content, please comment, share, like, and subscribe to support the channel. You may also want to check out some of the other videos on this channel. See you next time.